Our guest presenter today is the Reverend Dr. Timothy Eberhart, and we want to note that he is a St. Olaf graduate in religion, as was said in worship. He graduated magna cum laude, which I believe means he was a notable Methodist among Lutherans. Translation. And a graduate of Vanderbilt, along with his spouse, who is also ordained clergy. Becky is right here. Becky, what's your last name? Are you also Eberhart?
I am, yes.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes.
Good, welcome. So we're pleased to have him join us. Tim is a professor of ecological theology and practice at Garrett Theological Seminary in Evanston, so one of our United Methodist seminaries, and director of the Center for Ecological Regeneration, and is currently involved with a 5-year Lilly Endowment Grant for encouraging thriving congregations. I hope we hear more about that in just a moment. So those are a few preliminaries, and Dr. Eberhart, please.
Thank you, Reverend Oglesby. Yes, a religion major, and in fact, the chair of the religion department at the time, and who I still say is my favorite professor whenever asked the question, Dr. Charlie Wilson, a Lutheran, yes, sitting in the back of the room. You might want to escape if he doesn't like what one of his students is saying. But, thank you so much for this invitation again to be with you, not just in worship, but in this time of learning. So you heard a lot from Bonhoeffer in my sermon, a Lutheran. Again, this being ELCA territory, me being a St. Olaf religion grad, that's appropriate. But for this hour, I'm going to spend some time turning to John Wesley, founder of Methodism. But first, I know you engaged last week with Dr. Mark Seeley, who I've heard speak several times before and is fantastic. First, let me place our engagement with one of our spiritual ancestors in context. So, looks like we're not yet moving. Tim, any recommendations? So 1972 is the year I was born. Thank you, Donna. The same year that the Club of Rome warned in a famous publication that exponential growth in population and Western levels of consumption, if left unaddressed, would collide with the limits of the Earth's biosphere and destabilize the foundations of planetary life as we know it. Any of you happen to read that book when it first came out? One, yes. 20 years later, in 1992, the Union of Concerned Scientists stated, quote, "We, the undersigned senior members of the world's leading scientific community, hereby warn all humanity of what lies ahead. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated." 1992, I was a sophomore at Olaf up on the hill. 2000, the year my spouse Becky and I were married, Nobel Prize winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen introduced the term Anthropocene to communicate the fact that we now live in a new geologic era. We no longer live, he argued, in the age of the Holocene, the 12,000-year period of relative stability which supported the rise of human civilizations worldwide. Instead, he argued, human activities, or anthropogenic changes, have replaced natural processes as the dominant force impacting the Earth and its many interconnected systems. A few years ago, the World Wildlife Fund published a report detailing the reality that over the last half century, so 50 years, I'm 52, over the course of my lifetime, 2/3 of all animal life on the planet have been annihilated. 98% of insects have vanished from the Luquillo rainforest in Puerto Rico over the last 35 years. Flying insect numbers in Germany's natural reserves have plunged 75% in just 25 years. You all know this is a very smart community and a very smart congregation, and I could go on. I won't. But let me quote from the Living Planet report from just a few years back, which concluded, quote, "The findings are clear. Our relationship with nature is broken." Our relationship with nature is broken. And so the task of our time, of this generation, is immense. We must repair our human relationship with more than human nature through a deep transition of all of our activities: economic, political, cultural, social, institutional. Thomas Berry spoke of this as the great work of integrating all human activities into the limits and needs of the biosphere. Joanna Macy, a Buddhist, calls it the great turning. The Stockholm Environmental Institute calls for a great transition from a life-degrading world to one marked by environmental resilience, human solidarity, and life's flourishing. So how? One of my theological mentors at Vanderbilt, ecofeminist Sally McFaig, who I think, Charlie, you first introduced me to way back in the early 90s, often said that this is an all-hands-on-deck moment. We need the gifts, the expertise of all the professions, all the disciplines, all the world's religious traditions. We need the best of all of us. And so in a space like this, we might ask, what is uniquely ours to do as a religious community? Well, all of what I've named is relevant in a community like this, but let me focus here. Here's what I believe. In order to make this transition, I believe that we will need to reconnect with the land. And not just as stewards or even caretakers, but in fact at a much deeper, more intimate and spiritual level. As the great nature writer Barry Lopez wrote, quote, "We once had," speaking on behalf of all humans here, "we once had a fundamental sense of well-being that grew directly out of our intimacy, our back and forth, with the sacred profundity embedded in the places that we occupied." And then he goes on, "In order to serve progress," quote, "it's been necessary for us to refute the assertion of indigenous peoples worldwide that the land is sentient. The land is alive itself. Because once place is stripped of geography, and if geography is stripped of spirit, then any old scheme for profit will fly." One of the more impactful books that I've assigned over the last few years in an ecological theology class that I teach is one by Mark Wallace. The title is called "When God Was a Bird: Christianity, Animism, and the Reenchantment of the World." Here I'll quote from an early chapter. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould writes beautifully the following, quote, "We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature as well, for we will not save what we do not love." Gould is right. The environmental crisis, including the climate crisis that we now face, at its core is less a scientific or technical problem and more a spiritual problem. because it is human beings' deep ecocidal dispositions toward nature that are the cause of Earth's continual degradation. The only hope for our collective commitment to saving Earth from our exploitative habits is to fall in love again with the myriad of creatures and landscapes that populate the living spaces that we all inhabit. Well, I'm not so sure if I would go so far as to say that it's less of a scientific or technical problem, because it is that. But I would say that the spiritual problem is at least as significant as the technical problem. And it is the one that communities like this are most responsible for. So to go back to Barry Lopez, we once had a fundamental sense of well-being that grew directly out of our intimacy with the places that we occupied. According to historian Lynn White Jr., in his classic 1967 essay in Science magazine titled "The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," it was precisely the destruction of these older understandings, native to all geographies and practices, the destruction of these by the dominant forms of Western Christianity, which ultimately led to the deep alienation in the modern world between human and more than human life. In Antiquity, he wrote, and here he's specifically referencing Europe, quote, "Every tree, every spring, every hill had its own guardian spirit, a spirit of the place. Before one cut a tree, mined a mountain, or dammed a brook, it was important to create and foster a relationship with the spirit of place. But by destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of the natural world." The great historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, similarly notes that with the rise of the Latin Church in Europe, the fundamental relationship between humans and nature was deeply altered. In fact, you can track the shift of Latin Christianity and the processes of deforestation in Europe directly. The church, he writes, quote, "attacked precisely those points at which the natural and divine were held to meet, cutting down sacred trees, breaking up ancient ceremonial practices, linking humans to their environs, and condemning, as pagan, all forms of piety based on the close observation of animal and vegetable life. Close observation of the turning of the moon, the sun, and the planets." So in light of this history and the close link, the complicity of dominant forms of Christianity with the ecological crises that we face, comparative religion scholar Bron Taylor has been arguing for some time that good Christians who care about the environment must leave the Christian faith and join a worldwide movement of green spirituality or dark green religion. Interestingly enough, Lynn White himself came to a different conclusion, ending his essay by pointing to St. Francis as the patron saint of ecologists. We sang his words this morning in the opening hymn. Quote, "Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also essentially be religious. In Francis, who he called the greatest radical in Christian history since Christ, we see a kind of panpsychism of all things, which deposes humans from their monarchical rule over other creatures and instead places us in a deep democracy of all God's creatures." So which is it? Is Christianity intrinsically incompatible with deep green spirituality? And if so, shouldn't those of us deeply committed to an earth ethic, shouldn't we leave the Christian faith behind? Like so many of your generation and my generation, and progressively more so younger generations have done, in many cases precisely because of this. Or might we, the current stewards of this religious tradition, might we, like Francis, actively embrace forms of piety that are rooted in the land? Might we also cultivate a spiritual reverence for the particular environs that we inhabit? Well, you can guess my answer. Not only do I believe that we might, I am convinced that we must. And so let me say it again. This is especially the work that we stewards of a spiritual tradition are uniquely equipped to undertake. You might say it's our niche. What might we contribute? We are stewards of a spiritual tradition. One more way at this. How many of you have read Robin Wall Kimmerer? Potawatomi, botanist, author, braiding sweetgrass, gathering moss, The Serviceberry is her most recent book. Beautiful writer.
Yes.
Kimmerer argues that one of the most important contributions to ecological healing needed today is what she calls reciprocal restoration. Reciprocal restoration, she says, is the mutually reinforcing restoration of both land and culture, such that the repair of ecosystems contributes to cultural revitalization, and the renewal of culture promotes the restoration of ecological integrity. We need both. She also uses the language of biocultural restoration, again, stressing the importance of revitalizing cultural and spiritual traditions that are aligned with the healing and the flourishing of the earth. Here I'll quote her. Here, and she's saying this as a scientist, here is where our most challenging and our most rewarding work lies, in restoring a relationship of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and love. So this is a lot of what I do as a professor of ecological theology and practice, or as a director of a Center for Ecological Regeneration. And I take up a particular focus on the Christian tradition. How have our Christian traditions and doctrines and practices been complicit in the planetary crisis we face, but also how might we draw upon, recover, and construct anew ways of believing and practicing the faith that are aligned with Earth's restoration? Well, I am happy to report that among the major Protestant traditions, we Methodists can claim that our founder, John Wesley, was something of an early eco-theologian. Now, to be sure, Wesley's theology is primarily focused on the relationship between humans and God and between humans and other humans. But there are many important hints in his writing, quite unusual for his time, that suggest that growth in loving relationship, right? That's Christian perfection. The going on to loving relationship in the whole of life. There are important indications that that ought to include the more than human natural world as well. In a journal entry from July 16th, 1756, Wesley includes a letter from a correspondent whose perspective that he clearly endorses, and that today we might call an animal rights perspective. I would ask if nature, reason, and revelation do not all plead in favor even of the brute creation. In fact, may not the great law of equity, doing as we would be done to, be extended even to them? Should we thus not expect that we should sympathize with everything that has life? Wesley, in a later sermon on the education of children, encourages parents to foster a loving posture toward all creatures. Quote, truly affectionate parents will not allow their children to hurt or give pain to anything that has life, but will instead let them extend the rule of doing as they would be done to every animal whatsoever. So the golden rule for animals as well as children and for humans. So these statements relate to what we might call Christian ethics, what humans, our Christians, how we are to behave. But if we turn to Wesley's theology or his understanding of God and God's relationship to the world, we also find some compelling passages. In fact, we might today call it a panentheist or even an animist worldview. In reflecting on the sixth beatitude, Wesley writes, the great lesson which our blessed Lord teaches us and illustrates is that God is in all things. We are to see the Creator in the glass of every creature. We should use and look upon nothing as separate from God, which is indeed a kind of practical atheism. To not see God in everything and everyone is practical atheism. But with a true magnificence of thought, survey heaven and earth and all that is contained, as contained by God, who by his intimate presence holds them all in being, and listen to this, who pervades and actuates the whole, and is in true sense the soul of the universe. God, the soul of the universe. God in all things, nothing separate from the divine. Similarly, in a sermon titled Spiritual Worship, speaking about Christ's ongoing presence in the creation, he writes, Christ is now the life of everything, including that of vegetables. He is the fountain of the life of animals, the power by which the heart beats, the circulating juices flow. He is the fountain of all life, which we possess in common with all animals. And then it wouldn't be a Methodist presentation if it didn't reference Charles in the hymns. Here, John's brother Charles pens a hymn in which he writes, Thou dost create the earth anew, its maker and preserver too. By thine almighty arm sustained, nature perceives thy secret force, and still holds on her even course, and owns thy providential reign. Here again this phrase, thou art the universal soul. And when he says plastic, he means malleable. Don't think of single use. The malleable power that fills the whole, and governs earth, air, sea, and sky, the creatures all thy breath receive, and who by thy inspiring live, without thy inspiration die. So I want to read a quote next from Vine Deloria Jr., one of the most important and influential native philosophers of the 20th century. He affirmed, thus it is with the most common feature of indigenous awareness of the world. The feeling or belief that the universe is energized by a pervading power. A power in the universe that affects and influences us all. Wakantanka, Great Spirit, Universal Soul, animating all our relations, whom we are to treat with love. So here we might reframe Christian perfection to be the going on to loving relationship with all our relations. So what exactly then do I have in mind? What am I asking us to do? Among the many tasks needed for the great transition, the great work, I am convinced that we're going to need all of our religious communities from all traditions, all faiths, to help us become spiritually native again to our places, to become spiritually indigenous again to the environs within which we literally live and move and have our being. So I want to leave time for engagement, so I'm just going to offer a few concrete possibilities. First, by fostering a deep and an intimate spiritual reverence for all life, cherishing the animating power of God within each life form, treating each species, each element, each flow of energy, every place as inherently sacred, deserving of respect, of attention and awareness, and deserving of a relational ethic of mutuality and reciprocity. So this does mean extending Jesus' call to love your neighbor as yourself to include all persons, all others, human and more than human. And genuine love seeks to know about and delight in the uniqueness of the other. And so we need to learn the names of the plants and the wildlife and the soil types and the rock formations and more right outside our front doors, right outside on the church grounds, in our neighborhoods, in our larger bioregion. We need to find out what they need to flourish, what they need to live well, to be happy. And then we might need to figure out what is threatening them, what is causing them to suffer. And perhaps then ultimately we might need to be prepared to defend them, to give of ourselves sacrificially so that they might live. As we do so, we will need to draw upon the knowledge of the natural sciences, the earth system sciences, wildlife groups, and more. And much of that expertise, just having engaged a few of you this morning, exists in this room, in your congregation. And as we do so, let us remember to approach all of this in a spirit of contemplative delight. Let's allow ourselves to fall in love and to be loved in return in these relational, ecological bounds of kinship. Second, I think we need to recover and, in many cases, create new liturgies and new rituals and new religious practices that are rooted in the land, that are rooted in our local watersheds and bioregions. So how might the hymns we sing and the calls to worship that we share in, and the prayers of confession that we offer, and the collecting of the gifts that we bring, and the gathering of the elements we consume, how might all of this more deeply ground us in our local environs? What if at least once a quarter, if not monthly, we gathered outside to worship, joining our hearts and our voices in praise and thanksgiving with the trees and the songbirds and the grasses and the creeks? Well, a growing number of those in the Wild Church Network are doing just this. You can find ways to connect at wildchurchnetwork.com. And here I would recommend founder Victoria Lures' book, Church of the Wild, and the follow-up companion volume just published, Field Guide to Church of the Wild. Third, I would argue we need to return our religious beliefs to the earth, a kind of theological back to the land movement. Here I'll quote from Dr. Willie Jennings, who teaches at Yale Divinity School. He writes, "These days I am trying to understand how to be Christian in the dirt. which means I'm trying to think theologically from dirt and trees, sky and water, ocean and animals, not as a background to life, but as the reality of connection that prepares us for the living of life together. I believe theology and theological education, and congregational education, let's add, must be reframed inside a more expansive ecological awareness, one that magnifies the sinews of our connectivity to the level of pedagogy, that is, to the level of our guiding, teaching, and learning. Finally, and maybe this ought to be first, I think I messed this up again, there we go. Finally, it's time for us to learn as much as we can about the histories of the first peoples of this area, those who were and are native to this region. It's time for us to learn about the relations between the native peoples of the land and all those that they consider kin. We must learn about the sacred sites, the cosmologies, and the ceremonies that are indigenous to this landscape. And as we do so, I would invite us to not do so in the paternalistic mindset of those who think their spiritual tradition to be superior, or even of those who come out of charity or even justice seeking. I would encourage us to approach the wisdom keepers of our native communities, first and foremost out of a sense of desperate need, a recognition of how impoverished we are in understanding the advanced knowledge of how to live in right relationship with the particular places we inhabit. Now, there's a lot more to be said, and there's so much more to be done, as you all know. I didn't share anything about forming congregational green teams. I didn't recommend that you connect with the growing United Methodist Creation Justice movement. I didn't talk about getting organized politically or pressuring politicians and political parties to act decisively on the climate emergency, to join in resistance. Please understand that I want us to do all of that and much more. Again, this is the great work of our time. It's going to require everything we have. But what I am inviting us to do, amidst all of it, is to embrace a spiritual vision and to practice a spiritual life that grounds us in the earth, from which we were formed, and that connects us to the animating spirit and power at the heart of it all. Because, as James Gustav Speth, you've maybe seen this quote before, has said, I used to think the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. The top environmental problems, in fact, are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Well, I believe there are some scientists in this room who maybe do. But we can affirm that we, stewards of a faith tradition, we do know how to do this work of spiritual conversion. So let's get to work. Well, I have not mastered the art of this clicker yet, but we will get there. So let me stop here and invite questions, comments, and then with any time left, I'd love to explore a possibility of an ongoing partnership that we might take up going forward. Not just me coming for a Sunday, but possibilities to partner through a grant that Garrett's Center for Ecological Regeneration has received. But first, again, questions, comments, what do you think?
I do have a just sort of quick question.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put another metaphor in front of you, and in terms of relationship to the earth, and spirituality. Do you think it's still time for us to fall in love with the earth and one another, or is it time for us to be like the band on the Titanic playing "You're My God"? I just wonder, the element of crisis, which you've referred to and which Mark Seeley referred to last week in terms of the pace of change,
Yes.
which may overcome our capacities to adapt, brings an urgency to this. I just want to, I'm not saying let's all panic and run. I'm saying, where's our chunk of reality around loving things and acting with purpose?
Yeah. Yeah. I've for many years led a all-day workshop called Hope for Creation, and the first session is called The Great Uncreation. It's walking through each of the 7 days of creation in reverse, and with each one pausing to look at what our scientific community is telling us about the state of the planet in relationship to each of these, or the state of the good creation. It's not a session I enjoy leading or teaching. The body language slumps, the confidence in the room drops. You know this. Those of you who've been engaging the science for some time know it is hard news. Are we at a state of profound planetary crisis? Yes. Does that mean raising the alarm? Does that mean pressuring? Yes. Does that mean a hard reckoning with what it means? Yes. And that level can sustain movement building and sustenance to do the hard work ahead for a time and for some. But if that's the only level we're only speaking at, we often are left with the true believers who can handle that level of intensity all the time. And what we need is a much larger, broader movement. So how to properly calibrate to this moment? We're just talking planetary crisis. We're not talking political, economic, other intersecting crises. I do think the metaphor of all hands on deck is appropriate. And so then again, it's to ask, what is the work that a congregation, a spiritual community, might be rightly equipped to do? And among all of the actions, I again am urging us, let's take our spiritual traditions, let's take our stewardship of this tradition and our cultivation of spiritualities rightly aligned with this great transitionary work seriously. How would others of you answer that? Those of you who've been engaged in this work, who understand the depth of the crisis. How do you wrestle with that question? Yes, please.
I don't disagree with anything you just said. I appreciate it. But I take a step back to the Earth's 70% water on the surface and that importance. And just a quick example, 20% of the oxygen for planet Earth is produced by a single bacteria in those oceans. And what are we doing to those oceans? And I realize the connection between atmosphere and plastic in the water and all that. But from my point of view, the beginning of biology was in those oceans.
Yeah. I'm sure you know the work of the great oceanographer Sylvia Plath, whose work has been, who's been studying the health of our oceans.
Sylvia Earle.
Earle, thank you.
Sylvia Plath. An entirely different person.
A theologian, not a scientist, just to be clear. Yeah, Sylvia Plath, right. She concluded over a decade ago in her lifelong work with the state of our oceans that the oceans are dying and require our rapid, urgent response. So, and the causes of that, are, as you noted, are many, including our, Midwest agricultural, industrial agricultural systems, and a lot of that nitrogen phosphorus that runs down and creates dead zones. We're seeing that around the world. Other questions, feedback? How do you wrestle with these questions?
Got one here.
Yes, please.
I too can't argue with what you say we need to do in terms of a spiritual revolution. Unfortunately, within Christianity itself, there are those who, and Christianity itself does not put emphasis on this world,
Yeah.
but on the next.
Yes.
And there are many today who are looking for, as we face the end times, etc., that moment when the world comes to an end and we get a new world. That new world, I'm afraid, will be without us. It's not fair to blame, I suppose, where all this came from. It's been a long evolution from the time that we tried as humans to control nature, when we moved from foraging to agriculture and domesticization of nature. And then comes the Industrial Revolution, which occurred at the time that John Wesley was speaking, and the movement of Romanticism, Wordsworth, and everybody who, in their way, fought against or spoke against the beginning of that Industrial Revolution, taking us away from the land. I am very, very much a believer in the Aboriginal spirit and connection with the earth here in this country, and this continent, and also elsewhere in the world. That informs me more sometimes than Christianity does. But if we're going to face this and do what you're saying, we have to ask a question of ourselves. Every time we buy something, do something. And what we are doing is perpetuating while we are wailing and beating our chests. And my question is, how can we possibly, without a total collapse and restart, because I don't know how to do it otherwise, I can't see us overthrowing this political mayhem and direction that we are in, and industrial direction we are in, and just technological. I just don't see how we can overcome that and go back. Nobody's willing to go back and live on the land and with the land and give up everything that we have struggled for convenience's sake in our lives. And I don't know anybody who's willing to give up on most of their conveniences. And so I come back to Clay's question at the beginning. How much time do we really have to do this? And what is it going to take? I've read The World Without Us. I've read Collapse. And I'm at a loss. I'm at a real loss.
Yeah.
And it's tragic.
Yeah.
And I appreciate so much your comments, and what you're saying needs to be done,
Yeah.
does need to be done.
Yeah.
But it should have been done a long time ago to start.
We're
And
in a much better
wondering
place.
why
Yeah. Yeah.
Help me.
Well, let me go back to the question of what can I take up? What is mine to do amidst what will need to be a global movement of deep transition? How are we going to get there? What exactly is that going to look like? Is going to require more than just me to answer. To your first point, has the Christian tradition, have Christian teachings contributed to the crises we face? And the answer for me is unequivocally yes. Having taught in churches and church spaces for many years now on these issues, I mean, I often will get responses, something like, God said we are to have dominion over the earth. And God put fossil fuels under the ground for us to use. It is our God-given right, our vocation to do so. Or, if what you're saying about climate change is true, then it means that God is not sovereign. And I know deep in my bones that God is sovereign. Therefore, climate change cannot be true. So, in the question of what can I take up, or what might we as religious communities take up, this question of people's fundamental worldview, but an understanding of the way things are. You all know the reactionary right is well organized and is forming and teaching persons with a worldview that is very much opposed to, care for, or stewardship with, or as I'm encouraging us to do, much more democratic, animist relationship to the whole of the created order. So it's going to take far more than what I have or that we have, but this is work that we uniquely have to do. And if we don't do it, it's going to be filled by that more dominant voice of this is what Christianity is. And that's getting us into a world of hurt. Other responses or questions? And I realize we're coming up on time. So briefly, I mentioned the Garrett's Center for Ecological Regeneration that I direct. We've received a grant from the Lilly Endowment to work with congregations throughout the Midwest to go much more deeply into the science, into the ethics, into the implications, and into the theologies, the spiritualities that are both complicit with, but that also might lead us toward alternative futures. We've been partnering with Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church over the last year and a half, and have done really fun, dynamic work with them. We'll be partnering with St. Luke's in Indianapolis, with Yankton United Methodist in South Dakota, with congregations in Chicagoland and Southern Illinois, and more. And we've begun a conversation with your pastors about the possibility of Northfield being another partner congregation. Now, were there to be interest, and I think I'm having lunch with some of you, we can explore the specifics of that further. But I would love for this not just to be a one Sunday morning conversation, but perhaps the beginning of an ongoing conversation where we continue to wrestle with precisely the kind of questions that you've raised and have opened up over this series. So let me thank you again for the invitation to be with you all. I hope we stay in a good conversation going forward. Thank you all.